week 5, we read and analyzed the short story The Lesson and chapter 2 from Bless Me Ultima. We analyzed both stories to see what lessons the characters learned, what the larger lessons were for the reader, and how both authors used literary devices to emphasize and show these lessons. So the first story we will discuss today was the short story The Lesson. In it, the narrator and some of her friends are brought by almost like a surrogate teacher to FAO Schwartz. And the lesson that the kids learn in this story is all about inequality. All of the kids, we can assume all of the kids, at least the narrator definitely, come from a poorer background. She talks about how her mom ditches her with her aunt to go drinking at a hotel room, and it can be assumed that most kids are in a similar economic sort of situation with their families. So when they go to FAO Schwartz, the first thing that they see is a microscope that one of the boys points out to the group, and it is $300. And the teacher asks, well, how long would it take you to save your allowance to be able to afford that? And the kids start joking around and they say he would outgrow the microscope by the time his allowance would allow him to buy it. And then the attention shifts to a sailboat that is $1,195. And the kids are talking about how they've made sailboats for 50 cents from stuff from the local general store and from stuff that they had around the house. And one of those students that they're with, Mercedes, who, based off my reading, I assumed was probably from a wealthier family, makes a comment about, yeah, well, how well do they swim? How well do they float? And they say, well, they don't float very long, but it's still a boat. It's still a sailboat. And then when she goes into the store, the narrator sees a clown toy for $35. And she's thinking about what her mother would say if she asked her mother for this toy for like her birthday or something. And she goes on about how her mom would tell her that she could buy bunk beds for the boys, they could visit Granddaddy Nelson out in the country, or they could pay the rent and piano bill for a month. And it's all this. The kids learn through this experience at FAO Schwartz how unequal things are. They learn about how what one family pays for a toy for their kid, they could, like I said, pay their rent. They could get new beds. They could pay piano bills. And there's a line in the story that goes, I don't think all of us here put together eat in a year what that sailboat costs. And the kids make a reference about how it's probably going to break anyways after you use it. And the macro lesson learned by the narrator and the other characters in there is how inequality has affected their lives and how unequal the world is that they live in. And they learn that through toy shopping. But the larger message in the story is how inequality is an issue in our society and how the way that the people on the top of the economic system work is very different from how the people on the bottom of the economic system live. And there's another quote from the story that says, poor people have to wake up and demand their share of the pie, and don't none of us know what kind of pie she's talking about in the first damn place. So that line's pretty much saying how poor people need to stand up for and need to try to get ahead, but they also need help because they don't even know what they're missing out on. It's kind of like how even people in the middle class, like they have, to continue the comparison of a pie, they have pie every once in a while. Now the upper class have pie almost all the time. Middle class has it every once in a while, but the lower class and people living at and near the poverty line don't even know that pie's an option. Or if they do know that pie's an option, they can't get it. And there's another line later on in the story about how, well, that's not much of a democracy, is it? Because there's a quote that says, equal chance to pursue happiness means equal chance to pursue money. And the major lesson that we're being taught through this story is about inequality and how our system doesn't really work for most of the people living in it. It works for those at the middle and the top, but not for everyone else. And to portray both these lessons, the author uses diction in a couple of different ways. The first way that she uses diction is with names. Now there's a whole bunch of kids in this group, and most of them the narrator gives very rude nicknames to. But then there's Mercedes and Miss Moore, and she always calls Mercedes and Miss Moore by their names. That shows that even if she doesn't want to acknowledge it, she does have more of a respect for those people who are of a higher social class than herself and her peers. And I specifically read how I analyzed the story saying Mercedes was of a higher social class because she says how she's planning to come back to FAO Schwartz after she gets her birthday money. But that's not the same reaction that any of the other kids have. Another way that she uses diction is with how each character actually talks. Most of the children use poor grammar, specifically the narrator at times. For example, when she says, and don't none of us know what kind of pie she's talking about in the first damn place. That goes to further the theme of inequality throughout the story, to include inequality in education, because most kids who live in a poor neighborhood often go to schools in that neighborhood that are underfunded, and they don't have the same opportunities as students who live in middle and upper class neighborhoods. And then on the other hand, Mercedes and Miss Moore use proper grammar. Their speech is very eloquent and very exact with what they're saying. In the story Dose from Bless Me Ultima, the main lesson that the narrator learns and the larger meaning lesson that we learn are both the same. The narrator and the reader both learn how things are not either or. And the main character of the story learns this through his own family heritage. He throughout most of the beginning of the chapter, he talks about how his mother's a Luna, and he looks out at one point. He looks out at the moon, and he says, "Oh, it's this type of moon. That means my mother's going to be praying to her religion." And he talks about how his mom wants him to be a priest because that's part of her heritage and that's part of her religion. And he's the only one left to carry it out after his brothers died in the war. But he personally associates much more with his father and his father's heritage. One way that we see this is through a conversation he has in his dreams with his older brothers, who, like I said, died in the war, where he says to them that we must gather around our father. And in response, they say, "You are a Luna," they chanted in unison. "You are meant to be a farmer priest for mother." That's really letting him know that he's not just his father's son, he's his mother's son too. And because she's a Luna, he's a Luna. And he slowly starts to learn to embrace this. And I imagine it's probably a theme that grows more throughout the story. Again, the literary device used in this story to show this lesson is diction. Like I said, at the beginning of the story, it's very much, my mother's a Luna. That's her religion. That's her heritage. But in the dream sequence, his brothers tell him that you are a Luna too. So throughout the beginning of the section we read, we hear how he's pushing away that heritage, and and how he's associating with more of his father than his mother. But he also learns that things are not all one thing in another way through nature, through his relationship with Ultima, where before she came, he was scared of nature and he was scared of the power, specifically the river has. And she kind of tells him how the river's not bad, it's not good, it's just a river. It has a spirit just like all of us. And then this theme is also evident when the men kill the man who shot the sheriff, and he goes home and asks Ultima if those men will go to hell. And she says how it's not really up for them to decide, because everyone has some good and everyone has some bad. And this is a common trope that we see throughout a lot of literary works, where either the villain has like a redeemable quality, or the hero has a dark past, or like they're very mysterious, or they had some sort of past trauma, where we're not all one thing. We're made up of many different things from all aspects of our lives, all aspects of our families, and we have to embrace all of those to really be true to who we are. So two things I thought were really interesting throughout both these stories were that the lessons learned in the stories are very obvious that they're being learned by the narrator, but the same lesson is also being taught to us as readers, and we don't, at least I didn't pick up on that at first. And they do this in the lesson by making these very broad statements like, poor people have to wake up and demand their share of the pie, and don't none of us know what kind of pie she's talking about in the first damn place. Or the single line of, equal chance to pursue happiness means equal chance to pursue money. These little one-liners really show us that the lesson being learned in the story is not just for the characters, but also for us in our lives. And then in Dose, we learn the lesson by learning that the narrator is learning the lesson. So we see that he's learning how he should be and how he needs to be, and how things are not one or the other. And through him learning it, we're also learning it along with him, because this is a common theme that humans learn over and over and over again. We are so focused on trying to put things into like categories or boxes that we miss that things overlap sometimes. Another thing I thought was really interesting between these two stories is how both authors use diction in very different ways to convey their meaning in a short period of time. For example, like I talked about, Dose uses diction to show how he associates that part with his mother and how he pushes it away from himself at first. Whereas the lesson uses diction to further the inequality that these kids are facing between the economic inequality and the educational inequality. But the lesson also uses diction to show an underlying respect for authority figures, or for figures who are in a higher social class than the students themselves. And I just think it's really interesting how they both use similar concepts in very different ways.